My wife texted me out of the family cruise. "You're not coming. My kids don't want you there." A week earlier, I bought them a $500,000 house. I didn't reply. I sold it while they traveled. You won't believe what happened when they came back. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. My name is Francisco. I'm 48 years old, and for more than 2 decades, I was the man who carried everything in this family. The one who woke up early, the one who didn't complain, the one who paid the bills, solved the problems, and stayed quiet when he should have spoken. Today I'm going to speak. It was 11 at night when I got home. That day, I still had my shoes on because I hadn't even given myself the time to take them off. My back was burning from carrying so much at the warehouse since 6 in the morning. I'd skipped lunch. I drove 40 minutes back with half-closed eyes, thinking only about arriving, throwing myself on the bed and resting, even if it was just for a few hours before the alarm clock rang again. I grabbed my phone almost out of habit. I always do it, that automatic movement we all have before sleeping. You check the phone, close your eyes, and that's it. But that night wasn't it. That night, there was a message from Marisol, my wife. I read it once, I read it twice, I read it a third time because my brain didn't want to process what my eyes were seeing. "Francisco, I talked to the kids, and we decided it's better if you don't come on the cruise. Emilio says they need space. Celia agrees too. Don't take it personally. It's just that they want to enjoy without tension. You understand, right?" I froze. The phone in my hand, the room in silence, and that phrase spinning in my head like a broken record. You understand, right? What did I understand? Understand exactly what? That my own family was excluding me from the trip I'd paid for, that my kids, the same ones I'd given everything to, had decided my presence was attention, that my wife, instead of defending me, had taken their side and was sending me a message at 11 at night, as if she were canceling a work meeting. I didn't answer. I turned off the screen. I stayed in the dark with my back leaning against the headboard of the bed, looking at the ceiling, and for the first time in many years something inside me moved. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something colder, quieter, like when water stops moving right before it freezes. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was crying, not because I was sending furious messages, not because I was calling Marisol to confront her, but because my mind was working, calculating, remembering everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd given, and asking myself how I'd reached this point. How the man who a week before had signed the papers for a $500,000 house for his family was now alone in a dark room, excluded from the trip he himself had paid for. I need you to understand something before going on. I'm not a dramatic man. I never was. In 23 years of marriage with Marisol, I don't remember going to sleep without solving a problem, without paying a debt, without fulfilling my duties. I'm the kind of person who isn't late, who doesn't fail, who doesn't quit, who when he says he's going to do something, does it no matter the cost. And that cost was sometimes enormous. There were years when I worked double shifts so Emilio could study at a good school. There were months when I ate leftovers so my family's table lacked nothing. There were moments when I gave up things I wanted, trips I dreamed of, time that never came back. Also, they'd be well, so they wouldn't lack anything. So when they looked in the mirror, they could say they had a decent life. And they achieved it. Boy, did they achieve it. Emilio, my oldest son, had finished college, had a job, had his own apartment. Celia still lived with us, but she never lacked anything. And Marisol, my wife, the woman I built everything from scratch with, lived in a well-equipped house. She went out with her friends, bought whatever she wanted, and never, not a single time, had to worry if there'd be money for the next month, because I always worried for her. And you know what broke me that night more than the message itself? It wasn't the exclusion, it wasn't the cruise, it was that phrase at the end. You understand, right? That phrase told me everything I needed to know. It told me that to them I was so predictable, so tame, so used to giving in, that they didn't even suspect I'd complain. They expected me to answer yes, of course, and joy. They expected me to swallow this like I'd swallowed so many other things. But something had changed that night, and they didn't know it yet. I woke up at 5:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before the alarm clock rang. Like almost always, my body didn't need an alarm after so many years. It had gotten used to waking up on its own when it was still dark, when the city slept, when no one was looking or applauding. I simply got up because there were things to do. There were always things to do. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at myself longer than usual. 48 years old, rough hands, dark circles that no longer disappeared with sleep. A line on my forehead that wasn't there 10 years ago, and my eyes, the eyes of someone who'd carried too much for too long. Marisol's message was still unanswered. I still hadn't said anything. I grabbed my coffee, sat in the empty kitchen, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to remember, not to hurt myself, but to be honest with myself, to understand exactly where I came from, what I'd built, and why that message from the night before wasn't just a hurtful phrase. It was the summary of a whole ignored life. I arrived in the city at 22 with a duffel bag and 3 changes of clothes, without contacts, without money, without anyone to open a door for me. My family was humble, from a small town where options were few and the horizon looked short. But I always had something nobody could take away from me. The willingness to work, to really work, not to complain, not to wait, not to look for shortcuts, to wake up early, endure the exhaustion, and keep going. I started carrying sacks in a wholesale market, standing for 12 hours, carrying boxes that weighed more than my dreams back then. I earned just enough to pay for a shared room and eat something decent, nothing more. But I saved. With monk-like discipline, I saved. Every week, I set aside a part, however small, and kept it. Not to spend it, to use it when the right time came. I met Marisol when I was 25. She was pretty, cheerful, one of those people who light up a room when they enter. I fell in love fast. The way men who've been alone for a long time fall in love. And when she told me she was pregnant with Emilio, I didn't hesitate for a second. I married her, rented a small apartment, and doubled my working hours. I don't regret any of that. I want that to be clear. At that time, that decision made all the sense in the world. I had a family. I had a reason to push myself harder. I had something to protect, and that moved me. It moved me in a way that's hard to explain if you haven't lived it. The first years were hard. Marisol stayed home with Emilio while I worked. Then Celia was born, and expenses grew. I had to look for a second job on weekends. I worked in a hardware store on Saturdays and Sundays for almost 3 years straight. 3 years without a free weekend, without going out, without really resting. I'd arrive on Sunday night, exhausted to the bone, and on Monday at 6, I was already on my feet again. Do you know how many times Marisol asked me during that time if I was okay? If I needed anything, if I wanted to talk? I can count them on the fingers of one hand. And even so, I didn't blame her. She had 2 small kids. She had her own burden. I took on mine and kept going. Over the years, I grew at work. I went from carrying sacks to supervising a warehouse. Then they offered me an administrative position that I took even though I had to study at night to be able to handle it. I sat in classes with guys 10 years younger than me, with my notebook on my knee and my eyes burning with sleep, learning what I needed to learn so I wouldn't fall behind. Nobody gave me that promotion as a gift. I earned it hour by hour, night by night, and the money kept getting better, little by little, but getting better. I bought Marisol her first car when we'd been together for 8 years. She cried from emotion, hugged me in the dealership parking lot, and told me I was the best man in the world. I still remember that. I still remember exactly how that hug felt and what it meant to me at that moment. I paid for Emilio's full college. For years without him having to work or worry about a single monthly payment. I wanted him to focus on studying, to take advantage of the opportunity one hadn't had, and he took advantage of it. Yes, he finished his degree, got a job, built his life. I was proud of him, genuinely proud. I did the same with Celia. I paid for her courses, her computer, her cell phone, her things. I never said no when she asked for something reasonable. I never wanted her to feel there were limits to what I could give her, because I worked precisely so those limits wouldn't exist. And with Marisol, I remodeled the kitchen she wanted. I paid for the beach trip she asked for every year. I gave her money for her things without asking for explanations. I took her to the doctor when she got sick and stayed in the waiting room for hours without complaining once. Perfect? No, I never said I was perfect. We had fights, we had distances, we had hard times like any couple that has been together for decades, but I was always there. Nobody can take that away from me. I was always there, and then last year arrived. After a long time saving, planning, moving carefully, I managed to gather enough to make the down payment on a real house. A big house in a good neighborhood, with a garden, with space, with everything Marisol had mentioned hundreds of times over the years. A $500,000 house. The house she always wanted. I remember the day I took her to see it. I remember how she walked through every room, touching the walls. I remember she looked out the kitchen window, facing the garden, and stayed silent for a moment. A silence I interpreted as emotion, as gratitude, as one of those moments that don't need words. I signed the papers a week later. Alone, Marisol didn't go to the signing because she had something to do. I don't remember exactly what I signed. I handed over the down payment and left that office with the feeling that I'd delivered, that all the sacrifice had been worth it, that I'd finally given them what they deserved. A week later, I received that message. Francisco. I talked to the kids, and we decided it's better if you don't come on the cruise. I kept thinking about something that morning in front of my already cold coffee in the kitchen of that house that wasn't legally mine yet, but that I'd paid for. I asked myself how many times in these years I confused their silence with acceptance. How many times I'd interpreted their comfort as love. How many times I believed that because nobody complained, everything was fine. And I realized something that hurt more than the message itself. That they'd never seen me as the man who built all this. They'd seen me as the man who was simply obligated to do it. That difference changes everything. And that morning, with the cold coffee and the phone still unanswered, I began to understand that the man I'd been for 20 years no longer had any reason to keep being him. The trip had been Marisol's idea. Like almost all the ideas that cost money in this family, it had been Marisol's idea. It was in January when she first mentioned it. We were having dinner. She was with her phone in her hand, looking at something, and suddenly looked up and said, "Francisco, I saw a Caribbean cruise for July. Emilio and Celia want to go. It'd be a family thing, something special." Just like that, with that naturalness, like someone who mentions we need to buy bread, without asking if it was a good time, without asking if I felt like it, without even asking if I wanted to go. She said a family thing, and in her head, everything was already calculated. I was going to pay. That was never in doubt. I didn't say no. I never said no. That was my sentence, and I'd built it myself brick by brick for years. I told her to check it out, to give me the details, and we'd see. She interpreted that we'd see as a yes, because in our history my we'd see had always been a yes. 3 days later she sent me the link, a 7-night cruise leaving from Miami with stops in Nassau, Cozumel, and Rhode Island. Ocean view cabins, meals included. Onboard entertainment. The package for 4 people cost $14,000. I looked at it, calculated, and without saying anything else, I booked it. That same week I put down my card, paid the first deposit, and let Marisol know it was already booked. Do you know what her reaction was? She sent me a message that said, "Perfect, thanks." 2 words. Perfect, thanks. $14,000 and 2 words. I didn't get upset at that moment. I was already used to it, but now remembering it in that kitchen with the cold coffee, that perfect, thanks had a different weight. It was the X-ray of what we were, of what I was to them. The following months, the cruise became the central topic in the house. Marisol talked about the cabins, the clothes she was going to pack, the ports they were going to visit. Celia started looking for restaurants at the destinations. Emilio, who lived in his own apartment, came on Sundays and sat with them to plan itineraries, as if it were the expedition of the century. There was an energy in that house I hadn't seen for a long time. Laughter, plans, enthusiasm. And I was there physically present, absent in everything else. Nobody asked me what I wanted to do in Nassau. Nobody consulted me about the cabins. Nobody included me in the conversation about what excursions to take. I was the wallpaper of that family, always present, never seen. Just once I tried to participate. It was a Sunday, and the 3 of them were in the living room with the laptop open looking at pictures of the ship. I approached with my coffee mug and said something like, "What are you looking at?" Emilio answered without looking up, "Nothing, Dad. Cruise stuff." And they continued their conversation as if I hadn't opened my mouth. Celia didn't even turn her head. I went to the kitchen, finished my coffee alone, and didn't try again. That was in May. By June, I'd already signed the papers for the house. Yes, amidst all this, amidst the cruise planning, the expenses, my work routine, I've been moving pieces in parallel to close the purchase of the $500,000 house Marisol wanted. I talked to the bank. I'd organized the documents. I'd done the calculations so everything would fit, alone without telling anyone the details. Because I wanted it to be a surprise. I wanted that when the time to sign arrived, they'd understand the size of what I'd done for this family. The signing was on a Tuesday. I left work at noon, went to the notary, signed everything, handed over the down payment. The real estate agent shook my hand and told me, "Congratulations, it's a very good decision." I nodded, put the documents in my briefcase, and drove back to work because I still had 4 hours left on my shift. That night I got home and told Marisol, I already signed the papers for the house. She looked up from her phone and said, "Oh, really? That's great." And went back to looking at the screen. Not a hug, not a question. She didn't even stand up from the couch. I went to shower, went to bed, and turned off the light. A week later, the message arrived. Now I understand it all with a clarity I didn't have at that moment. What Marisol did wasn't a communication error. It wasn't a poorly chosen phrase in a careless moment. It was the logical result of years of a dynamic built on a very simple foundation. Francisco pays, Francisco yields, Francisco understands. Francisco doesn't complain. She didn't expect consequences because there had never been consequences. Emilio didn't weigh his words because he never needed to weigh them. Celia didn't say anything because saying something would have required a level of bravery no one in that house had ever demanded of her. And I, who was the only one who could have changed that dynamic years earlier, had stayed quiet for too long. The day I received the message, they'd already bought the clothes for the trip. They'd already packed their bags mentally. They'd already distributed the cabins, probably without telling me. The cruise was leaving in 5 days. 5 days for this family to embark on a $14,000 trip, heading toward a $500,000 house that was waiting for them upon return. All thanks to a man they decided was better left ashore. That night, after reading the message for the 3rd time, I made a decision. I wasn't going to answer, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because words were no longer the right tool. I'd spent years speaking with actions, building with actions, proving with actions. And if I'd learned anything in all that time, it was that people who don't see your actions when you do them in their favor aren't going to listen to your words when you're hurt either. So I put the phone away, got out of bed, went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood looking out the window at the dark garden of the house I'd just bought, and thought about something I'd never allowed myself to think before. I thought that that house had my name on the documents, only my name, because Marisol had never asked to be included in the papers. And I, in an act that at the time seemed irrelevant, had signed everything in my name, only in my name. And in that moment, something that until then had only been pain started turning into something else. It started turning into a plan. They left on a Thursday morning. I watched them leave from the living room window. I didn't go out to say goodbye. I didn't carry their bags down. I didn't take them to the airport. Marisol had arranged that with Emilio, who came with his car early. I heard them moving around the house. I heard the noise of the suitcase wheels against the floor. I heard voices, laughter, the sound of the refrigerator door opening and closing. Normal sounds of a family getting ready for something exciting. Nobody knocked on my bedroom door to say goodbye. I saw Emilio's car drive away down the street at 7:20 in the morning. Marisol was in the passenger seat. Celia was in the back looking at her phone. They didn't turn around. None of the three turned around to look at the house when they left. I stayed at the window a moment longer than necessary. Then I poured myself a coffee, sat in the kitchen, and opened my phone. I had Ramon's number saved, my younger brother, the only relative I'd kept real contact with all these years. Ramon was different from me in many ways, more impulsive, louder, less patient. But he had something I always admired. He never kept quiet about what he thought, and he never failed anyone he truly loved. I sent him a short message. "Can you come this afternoon? I need to talk to you." He replied in 10 minutes. "I'll be there at 6. I hung up the phone and went to work. That morning at the warehouse was strange. I did everything I had to do. I checked the inventories, signed the reports, gave the instructions for the day, but a part of my head was somewhere else completely. I was calculating, checking numbers, remembering dates, thinking about every detail of what I'd signed 3 weeks earlier and what that meant now. The house was in my name, only in my name. That hadn't been an accident or a strategy at the time. It had simply been the reality of how the operation had happened. Marisol never asked about the legal details. She never sat down with me to review the documents. She never went to any of the meetings with the agent or the bank. I'd managed everything alone, just like I managed everything in this family. And the result was that on paper, that $500,000 property had only one owner, me. During lunch, instead of eating, I looked for Marco's number, the real estate agent who'd helped me with the purchase. I'd saved it because he'd told me to call him if I ever needed anything. At the time, I thought it was the typical salesman line. Now, it had a completely different meaning. I called him. He answered on the second ring. "Marco, I'm Francisco, the one with the $500,000 house." Francisco, of course. "How is everything? Any problem with the property?" "Not exactly a problem," I told him. "More like a question. If I want to put the house up for sale today, how long would it take to close a deal?" There was a brief pause on the other side. "It depends on the buyer," Marco said. "If it's financed, between 30 and 45 days. If it's in cash, it can be much faster." "Are you thinking of selling?" "I'm evaluating options," I answered him. "Can you come see me this week?" We agreed for the next day. I hung up the phone, finished my lunch without tasting anything, and went back to work. That night, Ramon arrived right on time at 6. He entered the house, looked around with that way of his of observing everything, and without me saying anything yet, he asked me, "Where's Marisol?" "On a cruise." I told him. He stared at me. "And you?" He sat at the kitchen table without me inviting him. That's how it was. Ramon poured himself water from the jug on the counter and waited. He knew I was going to talk when I was ready. I told him everything. The message, the house, the years, the $14,000 cruise. The perfect. Thanks when I signed the papers. The morning they left without knocking on my door. Everything. I talked for almost an hour without him interrupting me, except to ask a short question that helped me organize the facts. When I finished, Ramon stayed silent for a moment. Then he said something that stuck with me. "Francisco, you've been this family's bank for 20 years, and the bank is never in the picture, only in the debt." I didn't answer, but something in that phrase landed in a very deep place. I told him about Marco, the agent. I told him I was thinking of selling. Ramon wasn't surprised. He nodded slowly and said, "Legally, you can do it without telling Marisol." I explained to him that the property was only in my name, that I'd checked the documents that same afternoon, and there was no legal impediment to proceed. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Then you already know what you have to do." Marco arrived the next day at 5 in the afternoon, walked through the house, took notes, took pictures. It was a good property. We both knew that. Quiet neighborhood, good condition, well located. He told me he had active buyers looking for exactly that type of real estate. He told me about a young couple who'd been looking for something like this for weeks and who had approved financing. "How much time to close if they're interested?" I asked. "If they like it and the bank doesn't put up hurdles, 30 days, maybe 28. The cruise lasted 7 nights. Marisol and the kids were returning in 12 days. I looked at Marco and told him, "Put it on the market tomorrow." I didn't sleep very well that night. I'm going to be honest. Not because I doubted, but because when you make a decision that size, a decision you know is going to change everything, your body reacts even if your mind is clear. I lay there looking at the ceiling, listening to the silence of that house that suddenly felt different, bigger, emptier, but also for the first time in a long time more mine. On the third day after Marisol had left, the property was already listed. Marco called me that same afternoon to tell me he'd already had 3 inquiries. On the 5th day, he called to tell me the young couple wanted to see it. I opened the house for them myself. They walked through every room, looked at the garden, checked the kitchen. The woman looked out the window, facing the garden, exactly as Marisol had done months before, and stayed silent for a moment. But unlike Marisol, she turned to her husband and took his hand. On the seventh day, Marco called me with an offer. It was good, very good. They were willing to pay $487,000 in cash, without financing, closing in 15 days. I thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. I accept, I told him. Marisol had been on the cruise for 7 days. She still had 5 to go before coming back, and I'd just sold the $500,000 house I'd bought for her. I didn't send her any message. I didn't call her. I didn't say anything to anyone, except to Ramon, who, when I let him know, only replied with 3 words. Well done, brother. And while Marisol, Emilio, and Celia kept sailing the Caribbean, taking pictures for their social networks, enjoying the included dinners and the stops at the ports, I was signing the sale documents, calm, without screaming, without crying, without sending furious messages to anyone, just signing. Because I'd understood something fundamental that took me too long to learn. Silence used at the right time is the most powerful argument there is. The 12 days passed faster than I expected. Not because they were easy, but because I was busy in a different way than I'd been busy all my life. It wasn't the warehouse work. It wasn't paying bills. It wasn't solving other people's problems. It was something new. It was putting my own life in order for the first time in decades. And that, although it sounds simple, required more energy than I imagined. I'd hired a lawyer. His name was Gustavo. I knew him by sight because he'd handled some work paperwork, and when I explained the situation to him, he listened without interrupting me, took notes, and at the end told me, with a professional calm that surprised me, everything you describe is completely legal. The property was in your name. You have the right to dispose of it as you see fit. Then he added something I didn't expect. I recommend we also start the divorce process before she returns. It gives you a stronger position. I told him to go ahead. So while Marisol was posting sunset pictures in Nassau with the caption United Family, I was sitting in a lawyer's office signing the first divorce documents. The irony of that didn't escape me. Ramon was with me almost all those days. He'd come in the afternoons, sit in the kitchen, and simply be there. We didn't talk all the time. Sometimes we just drank coffee in silence. But his presence meant something I didn't know I needed until I had it. Someone who was on my side without asking for explanations. Someone who wouldn't judge me or would tell me how I had to feel. One afternoon, he asked me, "Are you going to be okay when they arrive?" I looked at him and told him the truth. I don't know how Marisol is going to react, but I do know I no longer care the same way I did before. He nodded. That's exactly what I needed to hear. The day before they returned, I went to the house for the last time. The new owners weren't taking possession until the following week, so technically I could still go in. I walked through every room. The living room where Marisol and the kids had planned the cruise, the kitchen where I had breakfast alone every morning, the garden she'd looked at through the window the day I took her to see it. Everything was exactly the same as always. The same furniture, the same walls, the same things, but it felt completely different. It felt like a place that no longer belonged to me emotionally, long before it stopped belonging to me legally. I took the few things that were mine. They weren't many: clothes, documents, some photos from when I was young, a tool that had belonged to my father. Everything fit in 2 bags and a small box that told me something about how I'd lived all these years, that in a house full of things I'd paid for what really belonged to me fit in 2 bags. I closed the door, handed the key to Marco that same afternoon, and went to the apartment I'd rented 3 days earlier, a second floor in a quiet building, 20 minutes from work, small, simple, with nothing unnecessary, but mine, completely mine. That night, I slept straight through for the first time in weeks. The day they returned was a Wednesday. I knew it because I had the cruise itinerary saved on my phone. The same one Marisol had sent me months before so I could organize the payments. The return flight arrived at 2 in the afternoon. I figured they'd be home around 5, depending on traffic from the airport. At 4 in the afternoon, I sent Ramon a message. It just said, "They're here." It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation that the moment had arrived. He replied, "Do you want me to go?" I told him yes, to be close but not inside yet, to wait for my signal. At 5:12 in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was Marisol. I let it ring. I didn't answer. She called again 2 minutes later. I didn't answer either. On the third attempt, she sent me a message. "Francisco, we're home. Where are you? The keys don't work." The keys didn't work because I changed the lock the day before, not because I wanted to leave them on the street, but because legally the property was no longer mine and the new owners had asked me to do so as part of the handover process. It was an administrative detail that at that moment had consequences I hadn't planned, but wasn't going to stop either. I waited 5 minutes before replying. Then I wrote, "Marisol, call me when you're all together. I have to tell you something." She called in less than a minute. I put on speaker. "Francisco, what's going on? The keys don't open. You changed the lock. Are you inside?" "No, I'm not inside," I told her. "Where are you?" "What does this mean?" "It means the house is no longer ours, Marisol." Silence. A silence so complete that for a moment I thought the call had dropped. "What did you say?" "That the house is no longer ours. I sold it while you guys were traveling. The closing was 4 days ago." Another silence. And then Emilio's voice in the background, sharp. "What is he saying?" I heard movement. I heard Marisol pass him the phone, or put him on speaker too. And then it was Emilio who spoke directly with that confidence people have who've never had to pay for anything. "Dad, what are you talking about? Did you sell the house? How are you going to sell the house without telling anyone anything? Are you crazy?" I took a second before answering. The house was in my name, Emilio, only in my name, and I had every legal right to sell it. That doesn't matter. It was the family's house. Mom was living there. How can you do something like this? With the same calmness with which you guys excluded me from the trip I paid for. I told them with that same calmness. Silence again. But this silence was different. It was the silence of someone who just understood that the ground they thought was solid wasn't so much. I heard Marisol in the background telling Emilio something in a low voice. Then she came back to the phone. Her voice had changed. Less confident, tenser. "Francisco, we need to talk. This is crazy. Where are we supposed to live?" And there was the real question. Not, "Why did you do this?" Or, "We didn't mean to hurt you." Or, "Can we fix this?" The real question was where they were going to live, because even at that moment, even after everything that had happened, the center of the conversation was still them, not me them. "That's no longer my problem, Marisol," I replied. And before she could say anything else, I added, "This week you're going to receive some documents in the mail. Read them calmly." I hung up. I stayed with the phone in my hand in the silence of my new apartment, listening to the sound of the street outside. A dog barking in the distance, a car passing by. The ordinary noise of an ordinary day. I called Ramon. He answered on the first ring. "How was it?" he asked. "Good." I told him it was good. "Do you need me to go?" "No." I answered him, "Not tonight. Tonight, I'm fine alone." And it was true. For the first time in a long time, I was fine alone, not resigned, not sad, not enduring. Fine, really fine, with that strange and new feeling of having done exactly what I had to do at the exact moment I had to do it. Without losing control, not even once. I heated up something to eat. I sat in the only chair I had in the new apartment and thought that exactly 12 days ago Marisol and my kids had walked out that door with their suitcases without turning back to look at the house. Today they'd returned, and the house no longer existed for them. Not as revenge, as a consequence, which is something very different. But what I still didn't know at that moment was that the story hadn't ended there. Because Emilio wasn't the kind of person who stayed quiet, and Marisol wasn't the kind of woman who accepted losing control without a fight. What was coming next was going to be much harder than the phone call, and I needed to be ready. The divorce documents arrived on a Friday. I know because Marisol called me 16 times that day. 16. I counted them. I didn't answer any. I sent her a message at 8 at night that said, "Tomorrow at 10 at the cafe across from the park. If you want to talk, I'll be there. Otherwise, the lawyer handles everything." She didn't answer the message, but the next day, at 9:58 in the morning, I saw her car park in front of the cafe from the window, where I was already sitting with my coffee. She came in alone. That surprised me. I'd expected her to bring Emilio as backup, as a shield, like she'd done so many times in the last few years when she needed someone to speak louder than her. But she came in alone with dark glasses, even though the day was cloudy, with that rigid posture of someone who is prepared for a fight, but is afraid of losing it. She sat across from me, took off her glasses. Her eyes were swollen. She'd been crying. That was obvious. And for a fraction of a second, something in me wanted to soften. That old 20-year reflex that said, she's in a bad way, fix it. But I recognized it in time and let it pass. Francisco, she said, and her voice had a different texture than on the phone, quieter, more controlled. I need you to explain to me what's going on. I already explained everything on the call, I replied. You didn't explain anything to me. You told me you sold the house and hung up because there was nothing more to say at that moment. She rested her hands on the table. They were clenched. Francisco, we've been together for 23 years. 23 years. And you simply sell the house without telling me anything and send me divorce papers, as if it were an invoice. And you exclude me from the trip I paid for with a text message at 11 at night, as if it were a canceled meeting. Silence. It was a short but thick silence, the kind that feels heavy. That was a mistake, she finally said. And the way she said it, fast, almost mechanical, told me she'd rehearsed it, that she'd practiced that phrase in front of the mirror or with Emilio the night before. I got carried away by what the kids said. I shouldn't have done it like that. No, I told her. You shouldn't have. But that doesn't justify what you did. Selling the house, Francisco. The house where we lived. Where am I supposed to live now? Where is Celia going to live? Marisol, that's a question you should have asked yourself before sending me that message, before getting on the cruise without turning back to look at the house when you left. She opened her mouth to answer and closed it. Something in that last phrase had gotten to her. I saw it in her eyes. We didn't know you were going to react like this, she said. And there was the phrase that said it all. We didn't know you were going to react like this. Not we were wrong about you. Not we failed you. But rather that they hadn't calculated my reaction well. That the problem wasn't what they'd done, but that I hadn't responded as they expected. How did you expect me to react? I asked her calmly. Without raising my voice, she looked away for a moment. I don't know. We thought you'd get upset, that you'd complain, that we'd talk when we got back, and what? And I'd give in as always. Marisol didn't answer. I've spent over 20 years being the man who solves everything in this family, the one who pays, the one who gives in, the one who understands. And you guys got so used to that you stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a service, as something that was always going to be available no matter how you treated me. That's not true, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. No, I signed the papers for a $500,000 house for this family. A week later, you sent me a message telling me not to go on the trip because the kids didn't want me there. And your explanation now is that it was a mistake because you got carried away. Isn't that treating me like something that's obligated to endure anything? Her eyes filled with tears, and this time I didn't have the urge to soften. Not because I was cruel, but because I learned in those 2 weeks that the tears of someone who only cries when they lose something aren't the same as the tears of someone who cries because they hurt you. It was at that moment that the cafe door opened. Emilio had come after all. He'd just waited outside, calculating the moment to enter. I know him. He was always like that, strategic, measuring when to intervene to have more impact. He approached the table with that walk of a man who thinks he's always right. He pulled up a chair without anyone inviting him and sat down. Dad, he said with a forced calm that wouldn't last. I understand you're upset, but what you did makes no sense. You sold the family house over a message. Is that proportional? I looked at this son whose 4 years of college I'd paid for, whom I'd taken to the doctor when he was a boy and had a fever at night, whom I'd taught to drive in an empty parking lot on a Sunday morning many years ago. Emilio, I told him, you were the one who told your mom I shouldn't go on the cruise. He didn't deny it. That told me something. The adults needed space, he said. It wasn't anything personal. It wasn't anything personal that you excluded me from the trip I paid for. Dad, money isn't everything. And there, in that phrase, spoken with such lightness, I felt something I hadn't felt for a long time. Not anger, something colder, clearer. The absolute confirmation that this boy, my son, had grown up in a bubble so comfortable, so well-funded, so protected from any real consequence, that he genuinely didn't understand the weight of what he was saying. "You're right," I replied. "Money isn't everything. That's why I signed the divorce papers, because what I lacked wasn't money, it was respect." Emilio hit the table with his palm. Not hard, but enough for the people at nearby tables to turn around. "And your solution is to destroy the family, sell the house, ask for a divorce, disappear. Is that what a responsible man does?" I took a moment. "What a responsible man does," I said slowly, "is exactly what I did for 20 years. Work, pay, support, sacrifice. What I'm doing now isn't destroying anything, Emilio. It's to stop supporting something that never supported me." Marisol wiped her eyes with a napkin. Emilio looked at me with a mix of anger and something it took me a while to identify. Later I recognized it. It was bewilderment, the bewilderment of someone who has lost the manual, who all his life had known exactly how his father was going to react to any situation. And suddenly, that father wasn't following the script anymore. "And Celia," Marisol said in a low voice. "Did you think about Celia?" "Celia is an adult," I replied. "And in the 12 days you guys were traveling, she didn't send me a single message, not one, to see how I was, to ask anything, to say anything at all." I paused. "So I think Celia is going to be fine." Another silence. Emilio tried to regain control of the conversation. He talked to me about the money, the divorce, what his mother was entitled to, the years of marriage, her rights. He used words like unfair, irresponsible, with a frequency that at another time would have upset me. But I talked to Gustavo, my lawyer. I knew exactly what ground I was standing on, and that ground was firm. I answered what was necessary to answer, without yelling, without insulting, without losing the thread a single time. Every time Emilio raised his voice, I lowered mine. Every time Marisol tried to shift the ground toward guilt, I brought it back to the facts. It was like being in a completely different conversation than the one they'd planned to have. After almost an hour, I stood up, left money on the table for the coffee, put on my jacket, and before leaving I looked at both of them. "The lawyer has all the information. Anything you need to know about the process, he'll answer you." I looked at them a moment longer. "Take care." And I left without slamming the door, without a final drama-filled word, without turning back. I walked to my car, got in, and sat in silence for a minute before starting it. Through the window, I could see the cafe entrance. Emilio had come out and was on the sidewalk with his phone in his hand. Marisol hadn't come out yet. I started the car and left. Ramon was waiting for me in my apartment. When I walked in, he looked at me and didn't need to ask anything. He just said, "How do you feel?" I sat on the couch. I truly thought about the answer before giving it. Like someone who finally said what he had to say, I replied, and who doesn't need to know how they received it. Ramon nodded slowly, stood up, went to the kitchen, and came back with 2 cups of coffee. We sat in silence, and that silence, unlike all the previous silences in my life, wasn't heavy. It was restful. The first 2 weeks after the confrontation at the cafe were the strangest in my life. Not because of the chaos, but because of the absence of it. I'd spent over 20 years living in a house where there was always something, a conversation, a complaint, a request, a problem to solve. A tension floating in the air like dust that never settles, and suddenly nothing, just my small apartment, my things in 2 bags and a box. The sound of the street outside, and a silence that at first felt uncomfortable and that over the days I learned to recognize as something I never had. Peace. Not the peace of someone who avoids problems, but the peace of someone who solved them. The divorce process was moving forward. Gustavo, my lawyer, kept me informed with short and precise messages. Marisol had hired her own lawyer, which was her right, and I expected it. There were moves, counterproposals, document reviews. All the cold and technical language that accompanies the process of legally dismantling something you'd built over decades. I read it, answered what I had to answer, and went on with my day. Work helped me more than I expected. There's something in physical routine, in arriving early, in having concrete responsibilities and fulfilling them, that anchors a person when everything else is in motion. I focused on the warehouse with a clarity I hadn't had in a long time. My coworkers noticed something different in me. I don't know exactly what, but several told me in different ways. One told me I looked calmer. Another asked if I cut my hair. A female coworker simply told me, "I don't know what happened, Francisco, but you look good." I didn't explain anything to them. I just said thanks and kept working. Ramon kept showing up every 2 or 3 days. Sometimes he brought food. Sometimes he arrived empty-handed, and we'd sit to watch something on the phone or simply talk. He talked to me about his life, about his own problems, about things that in years as brothers I'd never had the time or the mind to listen to. I truly discovered in those weeks that my brother was more interesting than I'd noticed, that he had opinions, stories, a way of seeing things that made me laugh in a genuine way. The kind that comes from his stomach and not out of courtesy. It had been a long time since I'd laughed like that. Emilio called 11 times in the first 10 days. The first few times I didn't answer. Later I started answering, not because I wanted to prolong the conflict, but because Gustavo had told me it was better to keep certain channels open during the legal process to avoid complications. The conversations were short. Emilio alternated between anger and something resembling negotiation, as if each call were an attempt to find the right angle to make me change my position. In one of those calls he told me, "Dad, Mom is devastated. Don't you care?" I answered him, "Emilio, I cared for 20 years. And during those 20 years, nobody cared how I was." Silence. This conversation isn't going to move forward if we keep talking about who is more affected. Talk to the lawyer. And I hung up. Celia sent me a text message on the 10th day. It was the first since everything had happened. It said, "Dad, I know you're upset. I just want you to know I wasn't the one who made the decision to exclude you. Mom and Emilio decided, and I didn't know how to object." I read it several times. There was something in that message that gave me mixed feelings. On one hand, I understood that Celia had always been the quietest, the one who went with the flow to avoid conflicts. On the other hand, silence is also a decision. Not objecting is also a choice. I replied, "I hear you, Celia. Whenever you want to talk in person, tell me." She didn't answer immediately, but 3 days later she called me and we agreed to meet the following week. That conversation with Celia was different from everything else. We met in Park, walked for a while, and she talked about things I didn't expect to hear. She told me that in the house, there'd always been a dynamic where Emilio and Marisol made the decisions, and she simply existed within them. She told me there were times she wanted to say something and didn't say it because the social cost within the family was too high. She told me that the night before they left for the cruise, she'd had a bad feeling, but hadn't known how to put it into words. I listened without interrupting her, and when she finished, I told her something I thought carefully about before saying, "Celia, I understand what you're telling me, and I don't hold a grudge against you. But what I ask is that in the future, if you have a bad feeling about something they're doing to someone you love, say it. Even if it's hard, silence always has a cost." She nodded with wet eyes. She didn't cry. It seemed to me she was trying very hard not to cry. I walked her to her car, and when she left, I stayed a moment in the park sitting on a bench watching people walk by. It was on that bench where I received Gustavo's call. "Francisco, good news." Marisol accepted the main terms. There are still some details to fine-tune, but we're very close to closing. I listened to him talk for several minutes about the technical details. I asked him some questions. I took notes on my phone, and when I hung up, I kept looking at the notes I'd written. 23 years summed up in legal terms and numbers. There's something deeply strange in that process. Not painful, necessarily, just strange, like when you open a drawer you hadn't opened in years and find things you no longer recognize as yours, but that clearly were important at some point. That's how it felt, like closing a drawer for the last time and knowing you weren't going to open it again. What did surprise me in those weeks was something I didn't expect: the amount of things I started noticing in my daily life that I didn't see before. Small things. The pleasure of eating what I wanted without consulting anyone. The silence of the mornings without tension floating in the air. The possibility of getting home from work and not having to solve anything or manage anyone's mood. The strange and new freedom that my time for the first time in decades was mine. I don't say it with bitterness. I say it with an honesty that took me work to reach. Because for a long time, I'd interpreted all that care I gave the family as love. And it was love in part, but it was also a cage I'd built myself brick by brick, convincing myself that a good man asked for nothing for himself. That belief had cost me too much, and I was starting to let go of it. It was Ramon who asked me a question one night that left me thinking for several days. We were in my apartment. It was late. We'd eaten something, and in a moment of silence, he asked me, "What's the first thing you're going to do that you never could do?" I didn't answer right away. The question caught me off guard because I'd spent so much time thinking about what I'd left behind that I hadn't dedicated real time to thinking about what lay ahead. I truly thought about it, and after a while I answered him, "Travel alone." I never did it. I always traveled to take someone somewhere or to work. I never traveled for myself. Ramon smiled. "Where?" "I don't know yet, but somewhere where nobody needs anything from me for a few days." He raised his coffee mug as if it were toast. "That sounds like a good plan." It was. But before that trip, before that new stage that was starting to take shape in my head, one last scene was missing. Because Marisol, who had accepted the divorce terms with her lawyer, still hadn't said her last word personally, and I knew her well enough to know she was going to seek that moment. What I didn't know was when, or what she was going to tell me when it came, or that conversation, the last real one, was going to be the most important of all. Marisol called me on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't her usual number. It was a number I didn't have saved, which told me she'd done it on purpose, that she'd calculated that if she called from her number, I probably wouldn't answer, and that from an unknown number, she'd have a better chance of me picking up, which was correct. I answered without knowing who it was. Francisco. Her voice, immediately recognizable after 23 years. I didn't hang up. "Marisol, I need to see you. Not to fight, not to talk about the divorce or the lawyers. I just need to see you one more time and tell you something." A pause. "Please." That please stopped me. Not because it softened me, but because in 23 years of marriage, Marisol had used that word with me very few times. She was a woman who asked for things as if they were a given fact, as if things simply had to happen because she wanted them. Hearing her say please with that texture in her voice, without apparent strategy, without Emilio in the background, told me something was different. This time we agreed to meet in the same plaza where I'd seen Celia days before. Neutral zone, open space, without the forced intimacy of a cafe or the formality of an office. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat on a bench across from a small fountain that spouted water with a constant and calm sound. I watched people go by, families, single people, young couples walking without a hurry. Marisol arrived on time. She looked different from the last time I'd seen her at the cafe, less armed, without the dark glasses, without the rigidity of someone who comes prepared for a battle. She looked tired, yes, but in a more honest way. Like someone who has stopped fighting against something and still doesn't quite know what to do with her hands. She sat next to me on the bench. Not across from me, next to me. That was also different. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Just the sound of the fountain's water and the distant noise of the city. She was the one who started. "I know I didn't come to ask you to change anything," she said. "The papers are going to run their course. I'm not here for that." She paused. "I came because there are things I need to tell you, and if I don't tell you now, I think I'm going to carry them for a long time." I listened to her. "I was unfair to you, Francisco, and not just with the cruise message. I was unfair to you for a long time." Her voice was low, controlled, but with something underneath that you could tell was hard for her to hold back. "I got used to you solving everything. I got so used to it that I stopped seeing the effort. I stopped seeing the man. I only saw the result. The paid bill, the solved problem, the fixed thing. And I never stopped to ask you how you were. I didn't say anything. I kept listening to her. The night I sent you that message." She took a breath. "Emilio had been telling me for weeks that they needed space, that you, and he always ended up in tension, that the trip was going to be better without that dynamic. And I let myself be convinced because it was easier than facing it, because it was always easier to go with the flow than to stand up and say something was wrong. She looked down. I didn't defend you, and I should have. The fountain's water kept sounding. Do you know what was the first thing I thought when you said you'd sold the house? She asked me. And before I could answer, she said herself. I thought about where we were going to live. I didn't think about you. I didn't think about what you must have felt those 12 days alone while we were traveling. The first thing I thought of was us. She shook her head slowly. That told me everything I needed to know about what I'd become. It was the first time in this whole story that I felt something I didn't expect to feel at that moment. Not pity, not anger, something more like the calm sadness of understanding that two people can fail each other in ways neither planned and that, nevertheless, have real and irreversible consequences. Why didn't you say anything before? I asked her, not with reproach, with genuine curiosity. In all these years, why didn't you ever tell me something wasn't right? She thought about the answer. Because you never asked for anything for yourself, she finally said. And when someone never asks for anything, you end up believing they don't need anything, that they're fine, that they can handle everything. She looked at me. I used your strength as permission not to see you. That hit me in a way I didn't expect. Not because it justified me, but because it was true. I'd built an image of a man who can handle everything, who doesn't need, who doesn't complain. And that image had worked against me for years. The people around me had learned to relate to that image and not to me, to the Francisco who solves things, not to the Francisco who also gets tired, who also needs, who also deserves to be seen. Marisol, I told her slowly, what you describe holds truth and I recognize it. But it's one thing that I didn't ask enough for myself, and another that you guys took that for granted. It's one thing that I endured too much, and another is the message you sent me. I paused. Both things are true at the same time. She nodded without defending herself, without looking for a counterpoint. She nodded. Is there anything I can do? She asked. And again, in that question, there was something different from everything before. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a strategy. It was simply the question of someone who genuinely doesn't know if there's anything to do, but asks it anyway. Not for this, I told her. What happened already happened, and what comes now already has its path. I looked at her, but there is something you can do for yourself. She waited. Don't repeat this, I told her. Whatever comes next, don't repeat this dynamic. Not with Emilio, not with Celia, not with anyone. Learn to see people before they leave. Her eyes filled with tears. This time she didn't hold them back. We stayed in silence another moment. One of those silences that don't need to be filled because they already contain everything that had to be said. Then she asked me something that caught me completely by surprise. Were you happy at any point in these years? Were you happy? I stayed with the question a moment. Yes, I answered her. And it was true. There were moments when Emilio was born, when Celia learned to read and proudly showed me. Some Sunday mornings, many years ago, when everything was simpler. Moments. I looked at her, but those moments stopped happening a long time ago, and we both know that. She nodded slowly with wet eyes and her hands quiet in her lap. She stood up a moment later. She adjusted her clothes with that usual gesture of hers, the one she made when she was processing something difficult and needed to occupy her hands. She looked at me one last time. Take care, Francisco. You take care too. And she left. I watched her walk away through the plaza without turning back, walking slowly with that visible weight of someone carrying something they still don't know exactly how to let go of. I watched her until she disappeared into the crowd, and then I stayed alone in front of the fountain. I caught myself thinking that conversation, the most honest one we'd had in maybe a decade, had arrived too late, not as a reproach, but as one of those simple and forceful truths life presents you when they no longer change anything, but are still worth acknowledging. If we talked like that 10 years earlier, 5 years earlier, even 2 years earlier, maybe the story would have been different, but we hadn't, and that was also part of the truth. I stayed on that bench, maybe 20 minutes more, looking at the fountain's water, letting everything settle. The 23 years, the sacrifices, the message, the sold house, the confrontation, the lawyers, Emilio, Celia, Ramon, the nights alone in the new apartment, and that last conversation that closed something in a way no legal document could have closed. When I stood up from the bench, I felt something in my body it took me a moment to identify. Lightness. Not happiness yet. Not euphoria, lightness. The physical feeling that something heavy I'd carried for a long time was no longer where it used to be. I walked back to my car slowly, without a hurry, looking at the plaza, the people, the sky that afternoon, which was a clear and calm blue. I got in the car, rested my hands on the steering wheel for a moment without starting it, and thought about what I'd told Ramon weeks before about that trip I'd never taken. About that place where nobody would need anything from me for a few days, about that version of myself, which existed before this whole story began, and which at some point had stopped having space to exist. It was time to find it. I started the car and drove forward. 8 months after that afternoon in the plaza, I was sitting on a small terrace facing the sea. It wasn't a luxurious place. It was a simple inn on a quiet coast. The kind that don't appear in magazines or on lists of the best hotels in the world. A wooden terrace with 2 old chairs and a table with peeling paint. The sea in front still that morning with that bluish-green color that only exists in certain places and at a certain time of day. A cup of coffee in my hand. No phone. No urgency. No one's problem waiting for me on the other side of screen. Just the sea, just the coffee, just me. And I thought, 48 years to reach this moment. 48 years to learn that peace isn't built by accumulating things for others. It's built by finally choosing yourself. I'd arrived there 3 days before, alone with a medium suitcase that for the first time in my life contained only things I wanted to bring, without space reserved for what others needed, without an itinerary built around someone else's tastes, without the silent responsibility of making sure everyone was okay before thinking about whether I was. It was my first solo trip in life, and it was exactly how I'd imagined it that night in my new apartment when Ramon had asked me what was the first thing I was going to do that I'd never been able to do. The previous 8 months had been a process, not an instant transformation or a perfect story of overcoming, a real process with good days and days where the weight of everything that had changed felt heavier than I expected. There were mornings when I woke up in the apartment and the silence didn't feel like peace, but like absence. There were nights when I checked my phone waiting for a message from someone and realized there was no one waiting to know how I was anymore. That hurts. I'm not going to lie. Even if you've made the right decision, even if the path you chose is the one you had to choose, there's a loneliness at the beginning of a new life that doesn't disappear overnight. Newly won freedom sometimes looks too much like emptiness until you learn to distinguish one thing from the other. But I learned. The divorce was signed 2 months after that conversation in the plaza. It was a clean process, without scenes, without last-minute drama. Gustavo did his job, Marisol's lawyer did his, and on a Thursday afternoon, I walked out of an office building with a document in my hand that put a legal end to 23 years of marriage. I sat on a bench outside, put the document in my briefcase, and called Ramon. It's done, I told him. How do you feel? I truly thought about the answer before giving it, like I'd learned to do in these months. Ready. I answered him. And it was exactly that. Not relieved, not sad, not victorious. Ready like when you finish packing for a long trip and look at the closed suitcase and know everything you need is already there and you can leave now. With Celia, things gradually took a different shape over time. We saw each other several times in those months. Short conversations at first, longer ones later. She was processing her own version of all this, her own inventory of what she'd kept quiet and what that had cost her. It wasn't easy for either of us, but there was something genuine in her effort to build a different relationship with me. One where I wasn't just the father who solves things, but a real person with his own history. One Sunday, she called me to tell me she'd gotten a new job, better than the previous one, and something she really liked. We talked for almost an hour. It was the first time in a long time that a conversation with someone in my family left me feeling good instead of drained. With Emilio, it was different, much slower, much harder. There was a period of weeks when he didn't call me at all. Then he started sending short messages, almost formal, like someone writing to a person with whom they have a business relationship. I answered him with the same courtesy. I didn't force anything. I knew that path, if it existed, was going to take its own time, and there was no way to speed it up without it being fake. The moment that changed something between us arrived in a way I didn't expect. It was a Saturday afternoon when he called me, and from the first second, I knew something was different. His voice didn't have the usual tension, that armor he used whenever he talked to me in these months. He sounded younger, smaller, in a good way. He told me he'd lost his job, that the company had had cutbacks, and his position had been one of the eliminated ones, that he'd been looking for something new for 3 weeks without results, that he was scared. He didn't ask me for money. That was the first thing I noticed. He didn't call to solve a financial problem. He called, I think, because he didn't know who else to call, and because despite everything that had happened, I was still his father. I listened without reproaches, without reminding him of anything that had happened, without using his moment of vulnerability to collect any emotional debt. I told him what I honestly thought about how to handle the job search. I gave him some contacts that could be useful, and at the end, I told him something I thought carefully about. Emilio, things between us are going to take time, but that doesn't mean you can't call me when you need to. I'm your father. That doesn't change. Silence on the other end. Then, thanks, Dad. 2 words, the same 2 words as always in this family, but this time with a completely different weight. With Marisol, there were no more conversations after the plaza, not because there was hostility, but because there was nothing left to say that hadn't been said. I learned from Celia that she'd gone back to work, that she was living in a rented apartment with a friend of hers from years ago, that she was fine to the extent that was possible. I didn't ask for more details. It wasn't my story anymore. Ramon became something I hadn't had in decades, a real friend. Not just a blood brother, but someone I chose to spend time with because I wanted to, not because obligation demanded it. We started seeing each other on Sundays for breakfast. A new, simple habit, with no purpose other than company. Sometimes we talked about important things. Sometimes we spent a whole hour talking about nonsense without it matching. It was exactly what I needed. At work, I was offered a promotion 3 months after all this, a regional supervision position that involved more responsibilities and a better salary. I accepted it without hesitation. Not because I urgently needed the money, but because for the first time in a long time, I accepted something good for myself, without asking myself first if there was anyone else who needed that resource, that time, that energy. I accepted it because I deserved it. And then the trip arrived. 3 days before leaving, Ramon called me to ask if I wanted company. I told him no, with affection, but without hesitation. He told me, good, that was the right answer. And he hung up laughing right there, sitting on that terrace facing the sea, with the coffee in my hand and the sound of the waves as a constant background. I thought about all the versions of Francisco that had existed before this moment. The 22-year-old boy who arrived in the city with a duffel bag. The young man who worked double shifts with eyes burning from exhaustion. The father who signed important papers alone because no one else showed up. The middle-aged man who read an 11-word message in the dark of a room and felt the ground move beneath his feet. All those versions had been necessary. They'd all had their function, and they'd all taken their toll. But this version, this 48-year-old Francisco, sitting in front of the sea with a cup of coffee and no urgency in the world, was the first one that existed completely for itself. Not to prove anything, not to support anyone, not to fulfill anyone's expectations, just to be. The sea was still that morning. A seagull flew low, almost grazing the surface of the water, and disappeared to the right without looking back. The coffee was perfect. The air had that clean saltiness that only exists near the ocean and fills the lungs in a different way than any other air. I thought about something Ramon had told me weeks earlier. One of those phrases of his that arrived without warning and stayed. People who give everything without asking for anything aren't generous. They're invisible, and one day they decide to stop being so. That day had arrived, not with anger, not with bitterness, not with the need for anyone to acknowledge anything or to collect any debt. It had simply arrived. I finished my coffee. I rested the cup on the peeling paint table, looked at the sea a moment longer, and smiled. Not for anyone, just for me, which was finally enough.